Hi, everybody. My name is Natalie Yeadon, and I'm one of the CEOs with Impetus Digital. Impetus Digital has built some of the best-in-class asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration and communication tools for life science companies. We work with companies across the globe for their physicians, payers, patients, and even internal staff members to do everything from virtual advisory boards, working groups, publication teams, investigator groups, medical education, and even doing things like brand plan rollouts and sales rep training. But more importantly, what we really fundamentally believe at Impetus is that everything starts with a conversation. And from these big, hairy, audacious conversations, we can move worlds. We can work with the provocateurs, the leading edge thinkers, the digital entrepreneurs, and everybody in between for us to collectively work to positively disrupt healthcare. And so I'm really super excited to have one of these provocateurs at the virtual table with me today. I'd like to introduce Shurjeel Choudhri. Dr. Shurjeel Choudhri is the Senior VP and Head of Medical and Scientific Affairs at Bayer, Canada. Before assuming his current role, Shurjeel was the global clinical leader in anti-infectives with the Bayer Global Clinical Development Group. As the head of medical and scientific affairs, Shurjeel is responsible for contributing to the Canadian and international development, registration, and post-registration scientific and medical support for Bayer's pharmaceutical products. He is actually a medical doctor by training, and he received his MD from the University of Manitoba, where he also did his specialty training in internal medicine and subspecialty training in infectious diseases. So prior to joining to Bayer, he was the assistant professor in the departments of medical microbiology and internal medicine at the University of Manitoba. He was the director of HIV/AIDS program at the St. Boniface General Hospital and the Manitoba satellite director for the Canadian HIV Clinical Trials Network. So welcome, Dr. Choudhry. So happy to have you on the show today.
Thanks, Natalie. It's great to be here, and thanks for giving me this opportunity on the Fireside Chat.
Absolutely. What a fantastic career. Good for you. I'm sure I've known you in my previous life. I used to sell HIV drugs back in the day. It's a small world. I've been talking to a lot of people who used to be in that space, who are now in the rare diseases area. But what a wonderful trajectory. So I'd love if you can actually just paint a picture for us at a very high level view of what your career path was like, how you got directed into the specific place that you find yourself today at Bayer, Canada.
Thanks, Natalie. And I think you sort of summarized the career path nicely in the introduction. So I don't have to go through a lot other than to say, I did my medical training pretty much all in Winnipeg. My MD, then specialty training in internal medicine. I should add that when I did infectious diseases, I did a research fellowship in Nairobi in Kenya, and that was related to actually HIV patients. And that was one of the reasons when I came back, I took over as the HIV program director at St. Boniface. But it was, and you probably remember this, it was a really interesting time in HIV care. We were just transitioning from the very first treatments, such as zidovudine, which was used initially as monotherapy, was not very effective in the long term and quite toxic, especially at the doses we used at that time, to where the protease inhibitors were coming. And so I had this fortunate opportunity to be part of some of these combination antiretroviral trials at a time when we were starting to make a real difference in the lives of HIV patients. And that experience in antiviral research was actually one of the reasons why I eventually ended up at Bayer. I had not really planned a move to industry, but Bayer at that time was developing some really novel antiviral agents against CMV and other herpes viruses. And there was this golden opportunity to work on them. And that led me to a career at Bayer, starting in the US medical organization, and then in global development, as you mentioned in your introduction. But as it happens often, the products we worked on, and initially the very first few candidates didn't work out. So I ended up working more on antibiotics like moxifloxacin, and then there was an opportunity to come back to Canada. So I came back to head the medical department here, and I liked it so much that I have stayed.
Good for you. That's awesome. And you know what? Canada is just such a blossoming space. There are so many neat things that can be done based on our population, the education level. It's a small enough population where we can do all kinds of really interesting experiments and pilots and trials. And so it's such a great breeding ground for innovation and novel thinking. So it is super exciting to have you back here and doing what you do. One of the things I thought was really interesting as doing some research on some of your background is that you also have a real penchant for all things digital. So tell us a little bit about how you're mixing medical with digital and what spurred your interest in the digital components of the healthcare system.
Well, you know, I have to say I've been interested in computers and digital topics from long before I joined Bayer, but I just saw this as a really important opportunity, both to improve patient care, but also I think to improve our own efficiency by utilizing digital tools, and perhaps also benefit the environment by going paperless. So I can't think of any one thing other than that, again, much like, you know, arriving in HIV clinical care and research at a time when new treatments were coming, I think I just have been fortunate to be part of this digital ecosystem at a time when the tools we have available have grown really rapidly. And if you just think about how we're managing to cope with the pandemic, had this happened even 5-6 years ago, it would have been much more challenging for everyone to work from home. And so some of the things that we had already done, you know, I'll just give one example. We had a very active sort of program to move all of our contracts from wedding signatures to digital, to use tools such as DocuSign. And because we had already transitioned over, it actually was not very painful to switch to a virtual way of working. Whereas when we used to need documents signed, we would have had to print them out, send them by courier, get them back. But now we could do it very quickly virtually, which it also means that it becomes much more efficient. You can track them better. You don't have documents sitting on somebody's inbox waiting to be signed. So that was true even before the pandemic. We could see the potential. I think what has really happened in the last few months is that it's really accelerated that transition, where as people start seeing all the value that existed, because some of these tools are not new, but we're using much more of them, and of course they've improved because the vendors have seen the value in enhancing the ability to do virtual advisory board, using tools such as Zoom or Teams. So I think it's that perfect storm. We had the tools, people were starting to use them, and now all of a sudden that has gotten accelerated. And for me, I think it's exciting to be part of that and to leverage it to improve the way we work, both in a customer-facing way, but also what we do internally.
You mentioned something really pivotal there when you mentioned the word customer-facing. And I know that you are super laser focused by the patient in everything that you do and how you run your organization. So I was actually just curious. We've got the pre-COVID world and the very patient-centric processes that we were following. And then we have the post-COVID world. There's been, as you alluded to earlier, there's been an acceleration of the adoption of all things digital. And I think in that transition, I'd like to find out from you, what have been some of the growing pains or the big, fast, forced hand adoption as it relates to the way patients were being dealt with by Bayer, for example, with some of your clinical trials. So what are some of the things that you've had to quickly change, modify, and adopt because of COVID-19?
Well, in a way, we've had to change pretty much everything, right? If you look at a historical way, let's take clinical trials and the way we used to do them. And then back when I was a global clinical leader, when you were designing a clinical trial, it involved a lot of face-to-face meetings with the thought leaders, the experts in that area, who would help us in terms of the clinical trial design. And these were both advisory boards, but also one-on-one meetings, and it involved a lot of travel as well, because you had to go where they were and meet with them. And then you would design the protocol, but then there was typically a very large investigator meeting with the investigators and their study coordinators to launch the trial. And of course, a lot of monitoring that was done in person at the site. The patients had to come into the study site to give informed consent and to be seen. The pandemic has upended all of that. Now, even before the pandemic, we were starting to realize that with the ability that some of the new digital tools offer for remote monitoring, for with telehealth, with some of the wearables we have and other devices, it was possible to start doing some things virtually. That has all gotten accelerated. And then, let me give you an example of the trial that we launched in collaboration with the Population Health Research Institute so early on in the start of the pandemic. It was very different than the way we did things back when I was at GCL. We had to do everything virtually. So all those meetings with experts, all of the meetings of the study design team, everything happened virtually. We, of course, had to involve not just the Bayer colleagues who were participating in the study, because it's a study is happening across 14 countries, but also the PHRI teams and their network across all those countries, and that was all done virtually. The patients, especially in the outpatient trial, give informed consent virtually, because it's not safe for them to be physically doing this. So a very different way of doing a study, but one of the things we were able to do is get that study started. And I have to give PHRI a lot of credit. We basically went from concept to first patient, first visit in less than a month. And it would have been unprecedented. If you think about a typical trial, it takes about a year to get to that stage. But because everything was happening virtually, because of the urgency and the need, we could greatly accelerate the process. So I think what it shows us is what is possible. And these digital tools help facilitate that, because some of the old ways of doing things also took longer and took time. But now we can basically get everybody involved around the world virtually. And I think overall you gain some efficiency by doing that. And that's what we start seeing with decentralized trials. I don't think the need for physical monitoring is going to go away. We still do need to go and monitor sites. There is definite value in meeting people face to face as well. And I think it's one of the things I really miss, because I love going to conferences and those serendipitous conversations you have with people you run into in the hallway are very important. That will still be needed, but I could see that we will not go back to the way we used to do things, because there are definitely some benefits of doing things virtually, and the
Yeah.
tools have gotten better, and they allow us to do that so much better now.
So you're really talking about a very interesting hybrid possibility in the future, giving people an Uber choices and making the choice based on a myriad of different factors, whatever is happening in their life. And so when we talk about the launching of new products potentially in a virtual world, where I'm sure there's some companies that have done that, to relaunching or starting new clinical trials completely in this virtual space, using all the tools and methodologies that you've suggested. There's also this opportunity to talk about the use of these new digital biomarkers. We talk a lot about real world data and evidence and evaluation, and really incorporating patients into that equation in a way that we've never done so before. We've always been utilizing, clinical research organizations doing the studies and doing the data entry. Now there's an opportunity to use real things that patients are wearing and using each and every day, including wearables, Fitbits, smartwatches, tools that sensors, things like ambient biometrics that are being utilized through typing, and everything in between, 24-hour glucose monitors, or things that are embedded in people's aorta so they can actually check all kinds of things having to do with their cardiovascular health. What is your thoughts around the future of these patient-reported outcomes, accountability, and being able to sort of supersede some of these traditional ways that we've been incorporating patients in clinical studies?
So that's a huge question, Natalie. So let's break it down step by step. And I think if you start with research and development, something that we are doing at Bayer, and I'm sure other companies are doing, is using some of these remote monitoring tools, wearables, to really phenotype diseases. Because any common disease we look at, let's take heart failure, is a syndrome. It has multiple causes, and probably depending on the cause, the treatment could be different. The phenotype is very different. And looking at the patient, they have heart failure. But if you start looking at some of the underlying physiology, there could be many important differences. And you can, with the wearables, you can do this, basically track the patient's vital signs, track some of the key parameters that we can now measure remotely to see what the differences are between these different types of heart failure. And this is especially important when you're looking at heart failure with reduced ejection fraction versus heart failure with preserved ejection fraction, which is an entity where there are really no effective treatments right now. So disease phenotyping, I think, is a really important thing that we can do with these digital tools. Patient-reported outcomes is another area which is very interesting, because all the instruments we use, the surveys that patients fill out, have a recency bias. You fill out a quality of life instrument, but the results are really based on how the patient's feeling at that time. So if they are having a particularly bad day, the day they fill out the questionnaire, the results may not look as good as a day where they're feeling actually much better. But you could collect a lot of that actual objective data using a wearable. So if you're looking at activity, you can ask the patient to remember what their activity was like over the past month, or you could just collect it from an Apple Watch or something that they're wearing, a Fitbit, that actually objectively collects their activity level for the whole month. And we can already start seeing that provides really useful information. So for example, there are data out there with Fitbit where they were able to predict who had COVID based on changes in activity level of the patient. So you can start immediately trying to use some of these signals to identify who may actually have disease that needs action. The same is true with the Apple Watch, and there are now publications out looking at diagnosing atrial fibrillation. But I think the next step, as these devices get more sophisticated, is really we would be able able to start anticipating significant disease events based on, say, heart rate variability. Um, so there is opportunity here, both in terms of designing better trials by looking at disease phenotypes, but also collecting more objective, real-time patient outcomes, um, and actually clinical outcomes using these devices. The the next step, I think, is to actually go even beyond the wearables to looking at the smart speakers that many people have at home. And there are already studies that are starting to look at um, what the speaker records. For example, the number of times someone is coughing. And you can start then establishing diagnoses based on that information. Um, and people are looking actively to see whether you could diagnose COVID just by listening to somebody's Alexa and how many times they're coughing, because that may be a change in their health. So it's an exciting space, I think, for both improving how we do research, but also how we manage patients long term.
It is just such a fascinating topic. I mean, I've seen you've created slides on this. People are talking about it a lot. It's an area that I love discussing. There is just so much there, and I guess, watch this space. But one thing that is really interesting is that at the end of the day, this all comes down to an accumulation and a collection of data, health data, tons and tons of it.
Mhm.
As we now know, data is the new oil. It needs to be refined properly, and it needs to be mined, and it needs to be filtered so that we are not using life sciences and physicians to be glorified data scientists. That's not their role. It needs to come back to them in a refined way so that they can actually do assessments and to be able to do the empathetic or the empathic way of being a physician and in treating a patient with care in a human way. So the question comes down to is we're inundated potentially or could be overwhelmed by all this data coming from everywhere. What would be some of the thoughts, Bayer and otherwise, for one, creating some interoperability somewhere either in a provincial or a national seamless lake that can be tapped into so that people can collectively work and do research and discovery and to be able to eventually do population health management. So what sorts of barriers need to be taken down in order for that to happen, including the way we currently have silos between company and company, that it's this company's research versus this, as opposed to some of the big seamless research consortiums that came up because of COVID. And then suddenly you saw people being able to do things that were unprecedented. So how would you respond to the need for data lakes and the barriers that are preventing us from doing these properly?
I think it's clear that we do need to break down silos. And silos exist across industry, but they also exist across government health systems. In Canada, health is a provincial responsibility, so we have multiple health systems across the country. And I think the important thing is that technology can help us break these silos down. So one solution is to have one data lake and everybody's drawing from the same data source. The other is to link them, almost like a pipeline that links all these different things together. And that is starting to happen too. I think technology allows that. So the data sit where they are, but if someone wants to analyze across, that can be done. I think we do need some common structures in order to really allow us to analyze these data in the most effective way, and that's starting to happen. So I think we probably will never get to a stage where there's just one big data lake. I think that's just unrealistic. But I can definitely see that based on the initiatives that are occurring right now and the tools that are becoming available, that we will be able to analyze these multiple data sources, even without moving the data from where it is. It is going to be really, really important because, especially in Canada, our population isn't that large relative to many other countries. So we need to be able to really look at the entire Canadian population when we're looking at these real world outcomes of the different therapies, of different health interventions. I'm pretty confident, though, that our tools will allow us to do that in the future. We'll have to definitely break down some silos, come up with some better systems for doing it, but it's starting to happen already. I know that CIHR and other Canadian organizations are actively looking at this. And it's, I think it's needed if we are to really improve the health of Canadians, to be able to really look at these data, not just at a provincial level, but across the whole country.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great opportunity also for global collaboration, overcoming, even globalizing trials for patients, breaking down barriers around language and time zones. And so there's just such incredible opportunity, I think, in the future.
I agree, and I think it's just important that this is not happening not just with health data, because obviously that's one element, but there are some really nice initiatives where people are starting to really connect the health data, the socioeconomic data, environmental data. A bit, you're probably aware of one of the studies that showed that how close you live to a major highway impacts your health outcomes. So which neighborhood you live in matters. So I think we need to look at this holistically, and because so there's some health outcomes we can address based on medications, and others need lifestyle changes, others need to address environmental changes. So I think what's really becoming possible, based on the computing power we have and access to these very rich data sources, and Canada actually has some really incredibly rich data sources, is to really look at all of these different elements together, and use them to improve the health of Canadians.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing, and we should be so proud of what is going to be possible in the future. What I think COVID-19 has been such an interesting case study. We would have never wanted this in a million years to have actually tried to create this. But now that it's here, it has illuminated and magnified so many important lessons for all of us in healthcare, giving us so much. I have never seen so much democratization of healthcare data that I've seen lay people newscasts talking about mechanisms of action and efficacy rates, and everybody's got their medical degree, just sitting there pontificating. So it's really interesting to see how this is filtered down at an everyday language level. But what it has also done, in my opinion, is magnified some of the inefficiencies of our system. Not saying that there isn't great things about it, but we think about the speed. We talk about government speed, talk about the speed of approvals. We talk about some of these inefficiencies on the reimbursement frameworks, things like CADITH. We're talking about Health Canada, how fast it takes or how long it takes for these approvals. These durations of these approvals before a company can actually start getting paid for all of the work and research and all of the money that they sunk into the costs of these drugs just get prolonged, and hence impacts the overall or longer term pricing. And so we're bringing in this whole PMPRB. But it really does kind of magnify the issues around inefficiencies and frameworks. So as we sort of accelerate into the future and think about what this could look like, if we were to reimagine through a systems approach about how this may look, what would you think that some of the lessons learned from COVID-19 and how fast or how quickly or how not quickly we've done things, and how this may impact future drug, chemical entities or otherwise approvals in the future?
So I think that, let me cover two very important aspects. I think the first, let's talk about innovation and PMPRB. I think what's becoming clear is that innovation is incredibly important. And if you just look at the work that has gone into very rapidly developing vaccines, or quickly looking at repurposing drugs for potential treatment of COVID-19, that that's work that is being done by pharma, because we are the industry that can actually we have the resources and the expertise to do this quickly. And the speed at which it has happened is just amazing. But if that innovation is not appropriately compensated for, it doesn't happen in this country. I think that, so, there's a whole debate about why Canada's not first in line for vaccines. Well, I think ultimately we want to, if we want to be first in line, then we want to recognize and reward innovation the way it should be. In terms of speed, I have to say, I've been quite impressed by the efforts that have been made by Health Canada and other government agencies to speed things up. Because the study we did, Health Canada approved it in half the time they normally would have. The vaccines, I think the way they have been developed, the way the government has proactively gone out and taken the risk of purchasing doses of vaccine even before the results were available from these pivotal studies, I think it is quite impressive, and we need to recognize that. So those are important lessons, I think. I think it's important to recognize the importance of innovation, to reward it appropriately so that we continue to do it in Canada. But the efficiencies that we have looked at in terms of how we've done these COVID studies, I think we can learn from them. It just shows that things can happen very, very much faster than they normally do. And some of the tools now we have available facilitate that. The virtual tools we were talking about can greatly facilitate some of the work we do in research and development. So there are important lessons to be learned, I think, in both of those areas. And the pandemic, I think, has taught us that, and it will continue to teach us some lessons. I think that, virtual advisory boards is a great example. We had the ability to do these long before the pandemic, but there was a preference to do them face to face. And over the past 6 months, we have done a number of advisory boards virtually, and I have to say, I think they're much more valuable doing them virtually than they were face to face. We're able to bring people together who otherwise may not have had the time to travel and come together. It facilitates participation from global experts who may otherwise would have had to waste several days traveling to and from Canada. The feedback we get is quite rich. So going back, I can see where we would continue doing some of these virtual activities because we see the value in them. But it was the pandemic that was the motivator to really move into this space. Otherwise, we would be doing them the old-fashioned way.
Absolutely. It's so right what you said, that, I mean, we at Impetus, we've been doing virtual advisory boards for 12 years. And it's just, unfortunately, since COVID, there's been a groundswell of momentum that people needing to virtualize their meetings for the very points that you've mentioned. So what I think is interesting here as well, too, is we have this potential for acceleration. We have this potential for modifying some of the framework and the structures and the approval bodies and people working together globally to make impact and make decisions. It does actually beg the question about what the future of pharma is, specifically in the development of chemical. So we'll just take for a few minutes the chemical entities. Chemical entities used to be considered blockbuster products, that you had a blockbuster in the cardiovascular space, or you had a blockbuster in the neurodegenerative space. But now what we've actually been noticing is a uber specialization, the precision medicine concept, where you're now niching products into very precise areas with XYZ niche, issues, the way it's being presented or a way a patient's presenting, and on the backs of genetic testing. Understanding people's genomics, and then basically, converting or bridging that particular genetic disorder with a diagnostic that studies that, and then bridges the gap with the right type of uber specialized medication that we have been calling recently a rare disorder. So is the rare disorder the new precision medicine or the new super niche of the once thought of big blockbuster product? And if that's the case, is CV suddenly broken down into a myriad of rare disorders? And if so, how is the healthcare system going to afford a myriad or a big soup mix of all of these rare disorders? How would a pharma company be able to delve into this and figure out what's right, what's up or down, and within the infrastructure of regulatory and reimbursement kind of in that concept?
So I think there clearly is a move to precision medicine, in particular in oncology. We are in this space as well, and there's in areas where there is a very specific target that you can target with your molecule. The opportunity is that you can treat a disease in a very effective way with fewer side effects and not expose a whole bunch of people to the toxicities just so that one patient would benefit. I think that there's tremendous value in that precision. Now in oncology, we were lucky enough that we do have some of those targets, and we can target these driving mutations that drive cancer and very effectively stop that progression. So that trend will definitely continue. I think as we're able to better phenotype these disease syndromes and target therapies specific to, the different types of heart failure, for example, that will benefit patients because the number needed to treat will be lower. We will not have to treat 30 patients so that one benefits. I think the blockbusters are not going to go away, though. They will be there as well because there are other areas. And if you look at anticoagulants, where the novel anticoagulants that have come out, all four are better than warfarin. And as we look ahead to the next generation of anticoagulants that are being developed that offer the potential of perhaps the same effectiveness, but with less bleeding, those could be blockbusters. So I think we will still have blockbusters, but we will also have many more of these precision therapies.
Absolutely. And on that same vein, we were just exploring the idea of the traditional pharma model, which has traditionally been based on the discovery of chemical entities. Projecting forward and seeing the new entrants in the healthcare space, consumer electronics companies, we're seeing the Googles, we're seeing the Amazons, we're seeing all kinds of players coming into this place. How is pharma going to partner or recreate itself in a new business model that maybe is looking at things like software as a medical device or digital biomarkers, or how to leverage the patient avatar or the digital avatar in the creation of real world data and using that type of information for the placebo arm of a clinical study, as an example, and not wrapping people up on the arm that's actually just getting the placebo. Or how are we, leveraging these new divisions in the FDA and Health Canada that's looking at these software applications for the delivery or the betterment of health and or prevention? So what is pharma to do as they reinvent or reimagine their business model?
So I think there definitely is a lot of potential for medical devices. And if you look at, let's start with apps. There are several apps that the FDA has already approved that are prescription apps that are used actually for disease management. And we're starting to get outcome data suggesting that they can be very effective, sometimes as effective as a pill in that space. I think that for sure there's a future there because these tools will help improve and manage chronic diseases. Pharma is, though, very much involved in these processes. I think we see the potential both for these digital biomarkers, including for identifying disease phenotype, but also for the follow-up of these chronic conditions as an adjunct to the drugs we have, but also in terms of smart delivery methods. And we already have smart inhalers, we have smart injectors, we have smart fills. What we don't have necessarily right now is whether these actually improve patient outcomes or provide clinical benefits. So I think we need to do those studies to show whether having these smart devices allow better disease management. And Proteus is a great example. They had the smart pill, the chip on a pill, but Proteus could not successfully commercialize that technology. So we have to look at it and say, what could they have done differently to improve value in order to perhaps be more successful using that technology. So I think just because the technology is there doesn't mean that it will immediately provide benefit. Similarly, we are doing work, and there's been a lot of work done in creating clinical decision support systems. Also, digital adjuncts to electronic medical records, to physicians to help better manage their patients. But there's very little outcome data right now that suggests that these decision support systems actually work better than what the physicians do in the absence of these digital tools. So I think there's a lot we need to learn in terms of how to effectively use this technology, not just because it's there, but to actually improve patient outcomes. That aspect, I think Pharma is very actively working on. We see the potential of using these technologies, not just to support the drugs that we develop and commercialize, but also on their own as commercial opportunities to better manage certain diseases and to improve patient outcomes just using these digital tools.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think what's really interesting here as well as we reflect on pre versus post COVID, it really, I think, has made us reflect on a lot of things associated with supply chains. I think there's a lot of lessons learned for Canada as we start to actively wait and prepare for the vaccine and where we are in that lineup. But I also think, PPE and what that looked like and what we will do in the future for preparation. But when we also think about supply chain, we also think about distribution of medications to patients. We're thinking about the old way where people were standing in pharmacies and waiting and potentially subjecting themselves to, viruses and other sorts of things. Now we start to see new entrants. We see e-prescribing. We see Amazon coming in with their digital pharmacy. We could potentially be seeing one day physicians using Amazon or something else to e-prescribe an app where it's going to be like a digital health app that gets prescribed and paid for by a payer, either private or public. And then there's this process of the distribution to the patient. So Amazon delivery, or there's some other kind of delivery mechanism. Potentially we could even be seeing way down in the future where people have their own 3D printer, where the prescription comes from the pharmacy, originally from the prescribing physician or whatever we're to call them in the future. And then it gets, customized with the right dosage in somebody's own home. Is this science fiction, Shurjeel, or is this a real possibility at some point?
It's definitely not science fiction because everything you mentioned already exists. And what we've recognized on the one level, what the pandemic did was it really disrupted global supply chains because so much cargo was traveling in the holds of commercial aircraft, and a lot of those flights were no longer viable. So when we were initially planning our study with PHRI, it was a challenge to get drug supply over because we were used to having so many flights that crossed the Atlantic, and now there were far fewer. But at the same time, I think the distribution chains for the companies like Amazon have grown and have gotten very efficient. So certainly in Toronto, if I order something today, I can get it tomorrow if Amazon has it in stock, which is quite impressive. So I can see why they want to go into, in the US, the pharmacy business, because they have the infrastructure to do so. And I think the regulatory landscape is a little more favorable to do so as well. I can see that happening because in the current environment, patients don't want to go to the pharmacy and be exposed to COVID. So I think if they can, if the prescription can be sent virtually to the pharmacy and they can then get a delivery, it certainly makes sense. The first 3D printed drug was approved by the FDA some years ago. So far, it's the only one, but I think where the potential for 3D printing really is combination therapies. So many diseases now require 3-4 drugs to be given together. And that pill burden is significant for patients. And I think in the future, I can definitely see the value if you could then, based on that patient need and what medications they're on, combine some of these into one pill by 3D printing, because they'd have to be customized individually based on their regimen. That would be a tremendous value. I know the technology exists. I've seen it in action in a number of startups. So the first one of them that can successfully commercialize it, I think, is going to have hopefully a significant market because the need is there. I have elderly parents. They're on multiple drugs for their various chronic illnesses. And if we could reduce that pill burden by half, they would love it. That possibilities there. I think there's a lot of hurdles to go through, including regulatory hurdles, in terms of how you ensure the quality of the product, the consistency from pill to pill. But I think those are all things that we can actually manage because the technology is maturing very quickly in that space.
We're also thinking about changing models on how drugs and health is being administered and monitored and managed. So getting away from sick care to well care. So we've talked a lot about preventative maintenance or prevention, but really putting the pedal to the metal or metal to the pedal, whatever that saying is, but really doing something that changes that. And so when we start thinking about patient adherence, which is always this ongoing issue, and patients filling out the prescriptions or taking it and maintaining it and doing it at the right level, at the right cadence, all these other things. Where can digital fit into this? Digital monitoring that's ambient, that's behind the scenes, that leverages the day-to-day things that people are doing. We even talk about things like, smart weights or, and I can see how Alexa and Siri and other things are going to manage what people are putting on their plates or putting into their smart fridges and determining, is this actually adherent to the food requirements with XYZ drug and then reporting it or whatever. What do you see happening in that whole patient prevention, monitoring, adherence world as it relates to new digital components?
So that's a great question. And I think, as you know, there are a lot of adherence tools out there. None of them has been shown to really work very well when you look at it at a population level. I think, I strongly believe we do need to get back to the patient. Before we look at the tools and the technology and how that can help support adherence, we need to really look at why the patient is not adhering. Because sometimes it's a lack of information, counseling. It may be what their physician has actually, if perhaps hasn't explained clearly why they need to be on that medication. So I would first look at that human element. because I expect that in many cases, the challenge is really not the patient forgetting to take the drug, or I think it's because the importance of why they need to be on it has not been explained to them, or how to manage the side effects has not been explained to them. And in particular for diseases where the disease itself doesn't have symptoms, and a high blood pressure is a great example. You're now giving a medication that is actually causing side effects. So the patient goes from feeling fine to having now side effects that their health condition is actually a little bit worse. But long term they'll benefit because their blood pressure is being controlled. So there has to be a way for them to sort of see what the treatment is doing, and that's where I think remote monitoring will help. So I think in diseases where someone can directly correlate what the medication does, the compliance and adherence is better than if they don't, if they're just taking a pill and don't know whether it's having an effect or not. So it's a complex issue. I think technology has a role to play, but I think even more so, it's really important as physicians, and then from our side as industry, to be better able to educate patients on why that drug is being prescribed. What are the side effects they should look for? I know there have been studies done, including using apps where if the patients were aware of what side effect this oncology drug was going to cause, and they were able to report back and have that communication loop with their physician or a nurse, then their adherence was better because they felt like they were being supported. And so I think we don't want to lose that human element. It's always going to be important. I should mention, though, that the pandemic has really highlighted that need for public health, for primary prevention, and that need to deliver care in the community as opposed to focusing on just tertiary care. And I'm hoping that will lead to more investment in this area, because I think right now we don't invest as much in primary prevention and public health as we should.
Yeah,
That may help also
it's
with
brilliant.
Yeah.
I think there's so many lessons learned from this, and I can't wait for us to dig into some of the research, retrospective studies that we're going to taking a look at this. But I guess to really close this, I mean, at the end of the day, you bring up such an important part of this, which is this is all ultimately about us, the patients, people with conditions, people who are caregivers, people who are using the healthcare system. It comes down to a question of the have and the have-nots. We've seen this with things like contact tracing. We've seen this even with things about what the division is going to be about who's going to receive the vaccines and not. And so there's a lot of illumination around things like who's going to get things, what is the demographics, what are the characterization of people, but more importantly about things like digital divides, especially when we start talking about some of these newer opportunities to be part of these global virtual trials, to be able to receive these software as a medical device. Is there going to be issues around people who have phones, who have the right type of broadband if they live up in a remote corner, a remote center or area in Canada? And then secondly, the question comes down to is if they were lucky enough to become part of these clinical trials, et cetera, is there some basic data bias that's already built into the AI, into the algorithms that may impact these patients somehow? What's your general thoughts on some of these issues?
Well, I think, first of all, I think if we're really going to leverage technology and remote monitoring, we will need better internet connectivity across the country. It's not easy in Canada. We are a very large country geographically. So the answer is not going to be to lay cable. It just is not practical. And I think the lesson that I've learned, and I'll go back to my roots coming from Pakistan, is there was a time when it was very challenging to get a landline in Pakistan. Back when I was growing up, it took literally a decade or longer for someone, they'd have to build a new exchange, and then there were a certain number of phones that could support. But very, very quickly they leapfrogged that when the cell phones came, because now you just put up one tower and all of a sudden you have a lot of people who can access a signal relatively cheaply. And the probably there are more smartphones now being used in phones in Pakistan than there are in Canada, because the population is so much bigger. I think the same is happening, it will happen in Canada. We're starting to see entrepreneurs like Elon Musk put up these low-lying satellites that can provide some really good broadband access anywhere. And I think that's probably part of the answer. So rather than trying to lay a cable to every house, which is incredibly expensive and impractical, I think that the technologies like these microsatellites or new forms of 5G, cellular connectivity is the way that everybody's going to get access to a signal. It is just a matter of time. I think that will happen. That certainly will be important to enable people who are actually not living relatively far from the major urban centers to get better internet access. So that's one very important step. And I'm just trying to remember what the second part of your question was, if you could remind me.
It was really just, I mean, the issue around bias and the algorithms and
Yeah.
these, yeah.
And the algorithms are biased. There's no question that the data you feed in is what the algorithm uses. And so if you only feed in data from one ethnicity or one population, that's what the algorithm knows, and it gets confused when you now are giving it data from a different source. So I think what the best way to control that is to make sure that as we're designing these algorithms, the data being provided to them is diverse and reflects the population that where this algorithm is going to operate. I think in Canada we're fortunate; we have a very diverse population, and we can take the lead in developing algorithms that reflect the Canadian population. They can also be thrown off by relatively trivial things. So it's the black box problem. I think we need to really carefully look at how the algorithm is working. And the example that sticks in my mind is an algorithm that was developed to diagnose pneumonia, looking at chest x-rays, and it worked really, really well until they tried it at a different hospital. And then it didn't work well at all. And it turned out that one of the key variables the algorithm was using was not the actual chest x-ray, but the marker for the hospital where these x-rays were coming from, where they saw a lot of pneumonia patients. So it basically was not looking at the clinical evidence of pneumonia at all. And when that marker went away, it couldn't diagnose pneumonia. So I think we need to be able to validate these algorithms. So if it's been developed in one institution, to really stress test it by testing it across other institutions, other places, to make sure it works consistently. Many of these algorithms have been developed by one hospital or one academic institution. We can't rely on them until they have been widely looked at. Something that has been developed in Toronto should work just as well diagnosing pneumonia in Manitoba. So that work is being done, but it needs to be done before we clinically start using these algorithms. And again, the input has to be reflective of the population, of the disease mix, in order to really accurately address these problems.
This is a fascinating topic, and I especially love, Shurjeel, that how robust your thinking is, not only just in the medical space, but just in the applications of the digital. I could literally speak to you for hours, and we've only touched on these topics, so maybe we'll have to set up a subsequent discussion. So good for you, super excited, and I know that you're taking a great leadership role on introducing and what it means to do work in the future in this new virtual world that we live in. So for those of you who are listening or watching this, We will be leaving links if you are interested in connecting with Dr. Choudhry at some point, or you want to do some work with Bayer or really find out a little bit more about what they're doing. So we will be sharing those links. And we do ask you if you want to check us out at impetusdigital.com. If you're interested in these kinds of conversations with stakeholders, physicians, payers, patients, talking about some of these beyond the pill ideas, innovations thinking, going beyond some of these really important things for your franchise or brand longitudinally, this is what we do with our asynchronous and synchronous virtual collaboration platform. So come check us out. Please like this video or subscribe. This is how other people are going to find our information. We appreciate your time today. Thank you, Dr. Choudhry. This was an absolute pleasure speaking with you today and wishing everybody a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you very much.